bulletin, and we focus in on one of our network writers in those Tuesday bulletins that we send out, in addition to the aggregation of the different information that we have as well. I do want to thank the production guys that are also making this happen. I don't know if all of this would have happened without Heavenly Father's intervention and stimulation for me to begin something on this level. I don't necessarily appreciate listening to my own voice or basically being on a video presentation, but I feel that the urgency of the situation is something that we need to be able, each of us in our own way, to confront. So the specifics here, we are going to be talking initially in these first few presentations on true U.S. history. And that is in a direct confrontation to the 1619 Project, which essentially was started by the New York Times. The format of this, though, is I'm going to kind of give a basic introduction or an overview, and then we're going to get into the meat of the program. So the concept of true U.S. history, a lot of people, may not necessarily gravitate towards that, but I see it in my own perspective as a more pervasive view of history, and that includes not just the secular history, but God's intervention in history. And you'll see what I mean as we go along in these different courses, and how you would be listening to interviews and things that I'm trying to draw out of individuals, because I believe that God is working in our time. I don't believe that he is just imprisoned in the Bible. So the ultimate situation is that when we look at history, people have a viewpoint as they assess history, and they understand it based upon what they've read. In the same way, that's how history is written. History is written by people who assess the events that are going around in their time, and they record them. They put them down in some way so that other people in the future would be able to read about what happened. But they are assessing things based on their own background. So we see much of history that we read about or that we understand is a secularist history. So that is the problem. The overall situation that we look at all throughout the course of human history is that there is a God, and he has actually intervened. We have the witnesses of people who have talked about or written about his intervention. And this is the overview that we want to have, is that it's not just one or the other, it's both. And so the true U.S. history is a combination or an effort to blend those two perspectives. Perspective of the secular events that happened, and also how God was intervening. And also there's an aspect of what we would talk about as God's providence. So we feel very much that America is in God's providence. He had a hand in the creation of this nation, and also is not remotely disinterested in what is going on in this history and as it unfolds at this point in time. So the way that I teach is a little bit different, and you may pick up on that. I'm not going to be teaching the traditional way of teaching history, because I feel that it's very boring. A lot of my students understand that, and I don't teach history in a way in which I feel that it would turn people away or turn people off from history. I had a Greek history professor at one point in time in my undergraduate days, and all he would do for class would open up the book that he assigned us to read and read it out loud to us, and half the class, or maybe more than half the class, would fall asleep, and they wouldn't even go to class after a period of time. So there is a way of teaching history that can engage the audience, and this is how I operate. If you have ever seen a very clear, peaceful pond, and you throw a rock into that pond, you would notice that there are ripples that branch out from that interception of the rock into the surface of the water. And this is one of the ways that history has occurred. Individuals or events have intercepted time in that way, and they reverberate outwards in that period of time, but also through time. So as you go through time, different events take place over time that were impacted by that one particular intervention at that moment. And these are cause and effect relationships. The other thing is that when we study history, one of the things that we learn is that there's different things that are happening in our time, and I call that the fruit of what had happened in the previous periods. So the seeds of the fruit that we're viewing or that we're harvesting today were planted back way before our time. And so we look at these different events from these types of perspectives. And there's other ways that I teach history as well. But the key here is that you need to understand what is happening right now. I don't get stuck in a history book. I'm very aware of what is going on in the world around me at this point in time. I primarily am looking at this as a journalist, as a person who has created an online newsletter, which essentially is a voice for a number of writers who are simple, everyday folks that have something to say about what is going on within our country, within our world today. And as a journalist, you begin to notice many different things. You actually take note of things from a different perspective than people just passing through. You actually try to understand what that cause and what the effect are that are actually presenting events as we move through life. So history is a recording of that. And a journalist is a person who records the things that are going on around them. And then historians are usually the people who pick up on those reports or those stories and try to make a sequencing that makes sense, something that other people could receive. So one of the things that we are going to be addressing is the issue of slavery. And this is the key point of the 1619 Project. 1619 Project has the premise that the founding of the United States of America happened basically on the foundation of slavery that existed in this nation. And the premise or the assumption that is somehow coming out of that is that United States of America invented slavery. A lot of people who study the progressive writers of our time, whether they're historians or journalists or whoever, they get a certain impression based on what these people are predominantly writing about. But what I want to go back to is what I said earlier. Those people have a perspective. They have a personal perspective on what it is that they are trying to communicate to people, what it is that they are essentially conveying through what they believe. And it's not necessarily history. For instance, we are aware that a lot of young people in this country are being indoctrinated in the public school system. It is not a history that they're learning, it's a perspective. It's a particular attitude that people have that they're portraying to people. They are trying to explain things the way they see them. They're looking through their own prism. Another way that I look at history is that we need to really understand the moments in time, not based on our own eyeglasses or lenses, not how we see things, but we need to understand that they were occurring at a particular period of time, and those events were they were specific to those people in that time. When we try to look at the people in the past through our lenses of the 21st century, and we judge them based on our value system at this point in time, it's incredibly unfair. And it's actually dishonest. And it's intellectually dishonest for people who are professors of history or people who are supposedly professors of any type of intellectual endeavor to be able to do that and portray that as if that is something that is honest. The ultimate is that each individual brings to the table what they understand that they have learned in their lifetimes. And it's not divorced from personal prejudices or even this concept of racism that is at the heart of the 1619 Project. So I want to get to a professor of this history. His name is Professor Howard Zinn. He taught at Harvard University. He passed away a few years back. But the concept of history, there are two main points that Howard Zinn was teaching, and it influenced a lot of people who basically studied under him and who took what he said and ran with it. One of the things is that he basically he portrayed history as something that it was only written by the conquerors or by the victors and not the victims. And so he presented this ideology or this belief that history was only written by the victors, which is true if you only stay within the secular realm. And the problem is if you stay within the secular realm, that makes sense. But I wanted to show you, and Spencer, you can show that slide of the first one that talks essentially about the history of humanity. And there is another part of history that is a religious history. The concept that history is only secular and it has nothing to do with God, it's premised on the foundation that people don't believe in God. And so you can easily discount the Bible in that respect. But for people who have faith and for people who believe in God, there is a history. And that history is a witness of those people who lived in that time. And it's a rich history. It's a very powerful history. And it has a purpose. Arnold Toynbee was a great historian, and he was criticized in many ways by a number of other types of historians who did not share his Christian perspective. Toynbee believed that there was a point to history, a purpose to history. Other people believe that all we're doing is just kind of spinning our wheels through life over time. I do not share that perspective. I would gravitate more towards Arnold Toynbee's perspective, is that there's a purpose to history, and that gets into the providential perspective. So if we look at these, these periods in time in which people basically lived and they experienced God in a very real way, they put those things down in history books. And much of that history is written in what we call the Holy Bible. Now, a lot of people who don't like that history would refuse to look at it. But I want to go back and deal with this issue of slavery. The overall situation, if we're thinking about the issue of slavery, it did not begin or originate in the United States of America. I want to have you do a little bit of math. I know we're teaching history, but I'm going to give you a math lesson. The 1619 Project basically goes to a point in time in which the Jamestown community that was founded by the English back in essentially 1607. 1607 was the beginning of what we would call James Fort. James Fort was the initial fortress that they created at that point in time to create their settlement in this new world. Now, this was the second attempt by the English to do so. There is an unknown period that is known as the Lost Colony. And there was a colony on a small island off the coast of Roanoke, which is the Roanoke colony. But when the ships came back to resupply the island, all the inhabitants were gone. So James Fort was the second effort for the English to settle in the New World. But the colony almost died based on a refusal to actually do much work. Now, obviously, they did have an intention to come here to primarily get wealthy, but many of the people that came here were indentured servants, and they came with an attitude that they could work. Some of the people who came in those first shiploads of people, they didn't have an intent to work, and so this almost killed the colony until a guy by the name of John Rolfe went down to the Caribbean and realized that tobacco may be a good crop. He could try to transplant that into the soil of Virginia. So that laid the foundation for the salvation of the colony of Virginia at that point in time. But the indentured servants essentially did not necessarily want to work. So if you do your math, 1619 was when they started importing slaves, because if you think about what an indentured servant is, an indentured servant comes over for 7 years, and at some point in time after that 7 years, he would be a free person. He could work for the passage on the ship, and he would pay that passage off in that 7-year period. And in some cases, they might be able to get a little bit of land or something. However, if you calculate 1607 to 1614, which is that 7 years, you realize that you have a number of indentured servants that are going to become free people. So what is the solution? Well, that was then the beginning point of slavery. 5 years later, they brought slaves. Where do those slaves come from? They came from Africa. So how many years is that? So you have a math problem there initially, but I'm going to give you a bigger one. From 1607, in reality, 1607, that is the beginning of the United States of America? No, it's not the beginning of the United States of America. 1607 is the beginning of the English colony. In 1783, the United States of America was formally established. And ultimately, in 1787, it was established under the Constitution. So where did slavery come from in reality? Well, if we go back to the land of Egypt, and I have a slide there, it's just a picture showing, how slaves were treated. They were treated inhumanely in many ways. They were looked upon as someone who could be beaten like this, and all they were good for was manual labor. This is the foundation of what we call chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is basically the idea that the people weren't people. They were actually not human beings, but essentially property to be owned like an animal. And so this is the beginning. Where did that begin? Did it begin in Egypt? No. I want you to understand, if those people who read the Bible understand how the Hebrew people got to Egypt, they got there primarily because Joseph brought these people after he was enslaved. So Joseph was enslaved before the Hebrew people became enslaved in Egypt. Slavery had existed for centuries. It has existed for thousands of years. The reality is, if we look at the issues of slavery, it has existed not only in that early period in Egypt, it has existed throughout the Middle East. It's existed not only in Egypt, but it also existed beyond that in the Arab world. And the Arab slavery predated the Muslim slavery that existed. So there's Christian slavery, and there's Muslim-oriented slavery. And one of the things that these people who are the progressive historians fail to mention, and it's really sad, because it's the Catholics have a term called the sin of omission, and what it is, it's really a sin which is regarding the omission of information or the information that would be relevant to a situation. It's just not existence, and so this is one of the key things that progressives will use. They will ignore parts of history, going all the way back to Karl Marx himself, who ignored significant swaths of history. So one of the things is that they ignore the overall situation of slavery, not only in Egypt, in the ancient Egyptian civilization, but there's slavery that existed through the Islamic foundation that took over most of northern Africa for a good period of time. They swept across northern Africa and on up into the area of Europe over the period of hundreds of years. And there was slaves, essentially in many areas throughout Africa, and most of the slaves that were essentially enslaved in Africa went to the east. They didn't come across the Atlantic Ocean. And the bottom line is that many people think, oh, well, slavery in the United States is such a horrible thing. That is a major fundamental mistake, to not really pay attention to this type of slavery. So slavery in the United States, and we will get into this in later sessions, but slavery in the United States didn't get essentially established until the carryover of slavery from the foundation of slavery in the British Empire. And it was a leftover that was left over from the British Empire. If you read the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that Thomas Jefferson does is he blames the British for introducing slavery into North America. So the Muslim slave trade existed for quite a long time, but you have to understand where those people went. And this map here of Africa, it depicts a number of different types of slavery that existed here. But slavery for the Europeans came about primarily because the Portuguese were exploring the coast of Africa, and they were trying to get around all of Africa over to India to trade with the people in India and the trade with the people of China. So this then impacted Europe. The Portuguese started selling slaves that they brought from slave traders in Africa. They sold those slaves to other European countries. There's some new research that's coming out of Holland. The Dutch also were the ones who brought slaves into the New World. They were exploring the situation of the New World, like the French, like the English, and like the Spanish before them. Certainly the Spanish brought slaves over and created slave colonies down in the Caribbean. And the ultimate is that there is a big deal in American history books, ones that students study, that basically talking about the triangular trade. And we'll get into the triangular trade in a different lesson. But if you look at this carefully, you can see that there was a reciprocating relationship in many ways. Goods and services were made, exchanged for those who would pay for them in Europe. And then who made those things? Well, that was coming out of the slave population. England was a great beneficiary of the cotton that was grown in the southern colonies at that point. So when we look at slavery, it was not invented. First of all, it doesn't even correlate to the time frame of when the United States of America was created. And the other side of this coin is that the United States of America fought a very serious war over the issue of slavery to some extent. So we resolved that issue. Problem is, did slavery go away in this world? No, it didn't. And so while we are becoming more conscious, self-conscious of how evil we are as white people for enslaving people, you have to understand Slavery existed for thousands and thousands of years before the founding fathers created the United States of America. It existed in North America, and not only because of the Europeans bringing slavery into North America. The Native Americans were slave owners long before the Europeans came across the Atlantic Ocean, and we'll talk about that in a later class. The overall situation is that the issue of slavery is not simplistic, and it's not something that came about primarily because of racism. It came about because other people were power hungry, and essentially what they wanted to do was to control other human beings. And it became an issue in which people began to defend it. In the defense of slavery, they had to come up with rationalizations and philosophies defending that slavery. One of those philosophies essentially was that the slaves were not human beings. And that was the core of the Confederate States of America, which a lot of people don't remember. Anyway, we have a lot of stuff to talk about, and I hope that this basic introduction has given you enough to think about and to want to come back and hopefully explore this together. One of the things that we're going to do is open this up for a Q&A session at the end of this particular session, which is coming up really soon. We're going to be able to ask and answer questions that you have, and it's going to be much more open. It's not going to be recorded. This is the only segment of our live show that is recorded. So if you want to learn more about the Citizen Sentinels Network, please go to our website, which is you know the basic beginning, but it's citizensentinelsnetwork.com. You have a lot of articles from incredible people there through the Citizen Sentinel newsletter, but there's a number of other things, a wealth of information on that site. Pray that you could come back and join with us again next week. We're trying to provide education. We're trying to provide a foundation for people to understand what is really at the heart of our country and what is the foundation, the true foundation of the United States of America. So if you can come back, we would really be happy to see you again next week, or you would see me next week. I don't see anybody out there. But in essence, we are grateful to have this opportunity. Again, want to thank Rob Pugh, and I want to thank the people who are behind the scenes putting this together. Thank you so much, everybody.